So yeah, just a couple things. So excited you guys are here. My wife and I are currently teaching a class on family discipleship, and it's mostly people in our life stage with little ones. But neither Jake and I have teenagers, and we know something shifts majorly when you're parenting a teenager or an emerging adult. And so that's why we like to bring in people. Well, no one's like Steve. I can't say people like Steve because Steve is one of a kind. Steve was. I took his class. It was my last class at seminary. It was sort of a random decision to take it, but it was career altering, ministry trajectory altering for me, and just so he is a professor at Fuller Seminary, longtime youth pastor, dad himself. But more importantly, I would just say, Steve, if this is all right, you're an advocate for young people. And you, I thought of myself as a young person when I came into your class, and I'm 32, and I'm like, things have changed in a decade, and there's so much listening and learning involved to know how to come alongside and love and encourage and support young people well. It begins with listening and knowing the challenges that they face. And so thank you for the work that you do, and we're excited to hear from you. So please, as we listen here, feel free to chat in any questions you have right in the chat box, and Jake and I will filter those, look through those, and hopefully we'll get to as many as we can for the last 10-15 minutes that we have together. So thank you, Steve, again for being here, and we'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Dane. Thanks, Jake. Hi, everybody. It's really, really great to be with all of you. And like these two guys said, it's no small thing that you'd give time on a Monday night to invest in yourselves and invest in what's important to you, and that's your kids. And so I'm really grateful for that. Dane was a pretty good student. I felt like I had a lot of power. Like if I didn't pass him, he wouldn't graduate. So that gave me quite a bit of leverage. But I think he's right. I mean, we talked a lot in my class about this idea of advocating for young people. And I think that advocating for young people is more than just young people. It's advocating for the family systems that they're a part of as well. So it's advocating for parents as well. And, you know, one of the things that we teach our youth ministry students all the time is just when you think about young people, you have to think about families as well. So it's no small thing that Jake and Dane would be thinking about all of you and thinking about what it means to partner with you and to support you, because directly and indirectly, they're advocating for your kids and for the systems they're a part of. So I'm really honored to join in for this short time together. I hope that I can offer you some insights that can be helpful to you, and we'll see where we go from there. And let me just start with this, and then I have some slides that I'm gonna walk you through. They're good slides. They're not boring slides, I promise, okay? Let's start with this premise, that you showed up tonight. So you're a good parent, okay? I am not interested in shaming you or adding to the list of more experts that tell you about all the ways that you're parenting wrong or there's more problems that you need to address. I understand as a fellow parent just that there's a lot that we're doing, and we're doing the best that we can. And so what this time can be about is not about pointing out all the things that you're doing wrong, but perhaps leveraging some of the things that you're doing right, and maybe evoking your imagination with a couple of more things as we navigate a really unique time in our kids' lives and in our parenting lives of this period called adolescence and emerging adulthood, which I'll explain in a second. Okay, so let's do it. I'm gonna go to the slides now, and this is the awkward moment, but I'm always hopeful that we're gonna do great. And we did it. That's fantastic. There we are. Okay, so I found the title of this seminar quite fascinating. Coming alongside adolescents and emerging adults in 2021. And what I found so fascinating about the title that was given for this webinar was the fact that, you know, we probably could almost make this title Coming Alongside Adolescents and Emerging Adults in March 2021 and then April 2021. You know what I mean? Have you ever noticed that the things that you used to do that worked with your kids don't work anymore? And you have to recalibrate and think of new tools to kind of continue to engage them. Parenting is this improvisational uh, aspect and challenge that we have, especially with our kids in who are adolescents and emerging adults, because their lives are changing so quickly in a world that's changing so quickly. And so I want to unpack that a little bit and see if we can give some language to that and maybe validate some of the different feelings you might have, and then try to walk us through some solutions as well. So things are changing. At one point, we have small kids. You can probably remember that. This is when I actually had short hair. But we have three daughters. That's Lauren, I'm holding, and then Kara is our oldest, which is next to my wife Jen, and then Elise is down at the bottom. And then this was last year. My middle daughter Elise got married, and so there's Lauren, Elise, my son-in-law Chap, my wife Jen, and then my oldest daughter Kara. Kids grow up, and so I'm with you today, not merely as a professor or merely as a researcher or as a pastor, but as a dad, someone that desperately wants to parent well and have a relationship with my kids and be there for them how I'm supposed to be or how I can be as their lives are twisting and turning, and as my life is twisting and turning as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is a we conversation. It's not a you conversation. It's a we conversation. So let's start with some definitions just to make sure that we understand even the title of this webinar, okay? We may think we know these, and you may, but let me just define the way I use these terms as any good academic would. So when we think about this idea of adolescence, there's a psychologist in the 90s, David Santrock, that said that adolescence begins with biology and ends with culture. Begins with biology, ends with culture, which makes perfect sense, right? Biology is usually the onset of puberty. Culture is defined as when society says, congratulations, we see you and recognize you as an adult. Adolescence begins with biology and ends with culture. Now, in the past, we might have said, well, that would make sense then that adolescence is basically ages 13 to 18. Age 13 is sort of the onset of puberty, maybe 12, 13. And then around 18, we just assume that that's the time that a person becomes an adult, and they go off and do adult things, and our parenting work is done, right? Well, we know something about this definition of beginning with biology, that actually adolescence is starting earlier and earlier due to a lot of different reasons, eating, nutrition, environment, multiple reasons. We see adolescence starting, especially in females, at age 10, 9, even 8 years old, okay? So puberty starts a little bit earlier. And at the same time, what we're seeing is that when societies, especially Western societies, are asked, well, when does a young person become a full-fledged adult? The surveys coming back are saying they're a full adult when they are age 26, 27, 28. Let's round it up, 30 years old, okay? So think about what that means for a second. We've gone from a transitional period of 13 to 18 being adolescence to potentially a 2-decade endeavor that young people are navigating through to move from puberty to when they are described or identified as an adult, okay? Now, 2 decades of being called an adolescent seemed a bit ridiculous to most developmental researchers. And so then this is where this idea of emerging adulthood came along. Emerging adulthood is really ages 18 all the way up to 30. It doesn't mean you are an emerging adult during this period. This is the period when people in their 20s experience some of the characteristics of emerging adulthood, and they're sort of navigating their way to adulthood. They don't feel like adolescents anymore. They don't feel like an adult yet. And so they're in this unique time. Now, let's just add a couple more definitions just so that we're clear. A lot of times you've probably maybe haven't heard the term emerging adulthood as much, but you've probably heard the term millennial. Now remember, millennials are a sociological term. So they are getting older with time. They were born basically around 1980, the earliest side of that cohort, up to about 1995, 2000. So right now, millennials are 21 to 41 years old, okay? They're not young anymore. They're in many ways parents. Some of you might even be millennials, right? So there's that possibility that that's happening. And what we have coming behind that is Generation Z, or some will call it iGen. And right now their ages 9 to 26, okay? What's unique about millennial and Gen Z is that I think that what we know from the research is there's something significant about when a young person grows up. So for the millennial generation, a lot of teenagers sort of smack dab in the middle of sort of the millennial cohort experienced 9/11. This changed their perception of the way the world works, how they feel safe, how they consider politics, what this means. And it had an effect on sort of their outlook on the world and some of the fears and hopes that maybe came to that. Gen Z, similar situation. I mean, in some ways, we had the explosion of the smartphone, which created a whole new dynamic for adolescents and also for families all around the world, as you all very well know. And then I think also we could say even this pandemic, I think it's going to have this significant impact on the way teenagers think about the world and the effects it has on the lives that they want to live going forward. We have yet to see what the ripple effect is, but this is going to be. But I think there are these significant times that impact young people. But they don't just impact young people, they impact parents as well. So think about this for a second. You might be thinking, like when you had small children, like, okay, you know what? The small kids are going to be fine. I know how to parent that. But the really tough years that we have to gear up for are ages 13 to 18, this short transitional period where we just buckle down, we hold on for dear life, we do the best that we can, but we know that at 18, like, I don't know, like rainbows and fireworks come out and everything is better going forward, and we send them off to whatever's after high school and we feel great. Well, we realize that that's not the case for parents anymore. We're realizing that if adolescence starts earlier, we're having to face new and bigger challenges earlier in our kids' lives. So the range of parenting has expanding because of our definition of adolescence. And if we think about emerging adulthood, then we're realizing that the parenting questions no longer stop at 18. They find their way all the way through their 20s in some cases. So if you think about it, and perhaps you're actually feeling it, you're sensing that there's a whole new set of questions that you didn't think that you would have to be thinking about. Like, if my kid moves home, what am I supposed to do with that? What if I thought my child was going to college, but there are actually 3 or 4 other options that they're thinking about regarding gap years, and we never really thought about what that might mean for our family. There's a whole new sets of opportunities and majors and career fields that when we grew up, that weren't even on the radar that our kids are interested in pursuing, and we don't know how to support or help them because we have no idea what these different subjects are about. So it makes parenting much more challenging because the world is changing and the trajectory is changing and the questions are changing, and so that relieves us with a lot of new challenges as parents. So if you feel it, I guess what I want to tell you at this point is, yeah, of course you feel it. You're not weird. This is the world that we live in. New challenges, new parenting questions that are arising because of that. Another way to think about it is perhaps when we grew up or a generation before us, life was pretty linear, right? You kind of had high school, maybe college, job, person would get married, and then they'd have kids, right? And in many ways, this is how most churches' programming looks, right? But what if the world was actually more like this now? This is the journeys of a lot of young people, which makes parenting even more challenging. And I think a question we could ask ourselves is, how does a church like program itself or invest itself for worlds like this that young people are navigating? Because this is more of the reality. Again, if it feels more complicated, if it feels challenging, it's because it is. So let's normalize that rather than think that somehow we're doing something wrong and we just don't have our act together. Okay. So with that in mind, maybe we just need to stop at this point and be honest with ourselves. And I think this can be really hard for parents. And here's why. Do you remember when your kids were really young? I just felt like when our kids were really, really small, we would take any advice from anybody because we just wanted to keep our kids alive. You know what I'm saying? Like, how do you change the diaper? How come they're crying? What have you tried? What food do you use? What are your sleep strategies? How do you sleep yourself? I mean, it's just like pure survival, and you will look for anybody to help you with that. But something happens when our kids get older. The collaboration begins to dissipate and the competition begins to ramp up, right? All of a sudden, asking for help looks like you're a failure, or you don't want to embarrass your kid, or you somehow don't want to do that. So what we find happening, and we see this a lot in some of the research that we did with our growing with research, was that parents would express this sense of feeling alone and isolated, like they were the only ones, and they weren't reaching out for help because I think they were afraid to, or embarrassed to, or they didn't know how to do that. So we've lost the collaboration along the way. But if they did reach out, I think what they would say to each other is maybe one of three things that I know I've experienced as I've worked with parents. Number one, I find that a lot of times parents are just afraid. I remember doing a seminar at the church that I pastored at for parents of fifth graders. Like fifth grade is kind of like this really crucial year, right? Like sixth grade, at least in our context, is like middle school. And like you're starting to think about puberty and you're thinking about everything that happens there. And I remember, looking at this group of parents, and I said to these parents of fifth graders, in 7 years, your child will graduate high school. And this mother, I can still remember her sitting over to my right. She instinctively put her hands up over her ears, like she just didn't want to hear it, you know? And I got it. I mean, she was afraid, like the thought of our kids growing up so quickly, and the work that we hope to do, and we wonder if they're going to be ready, and all that comes with that. Is a real feeling. And so I think that fear can sometimes drive the way we act or how we sort of process things. And it can be sort of a scary moment for us as parents. We hold that often, I think. I think another reaction sometimes is that of just feeling anxious, right? You've heard probably on popular news about the helicopter parents or the drone parents or the snowplow parents. I'll just admit, I think I've been all of them. I mean, you know what I mean? But I think as a parent, I think I have more empathy for them. I'm not saying we should be helicopter parents. That's not the point of the seminar. But I think when I look at a world that doesn't seem to help me parent my kid, I feel like I'm fighting forces more than the forces are helping me. There's something in me that makes me deeply anxious and deeply ferocious to do whatever I need to do to help my kid. Like, if this world's going to be that way, I'm still helicopter parent, no problem. I'll be drone parent, I'm in. Like, I will fight for my kid. You know what I mean? And so I think that there can be this deep sense of anxiousness because we sometimes feel like the currents in society are stacked against us, and we will advocate for our kids in any way possible. So I don't know, maybe I'm the only one that feels that way, but I feel anxious sometimes. And then I think sometimes I've talked with parents who feel like they're at a loss. This is just a hypothetical age, but at age 12, something happens. Like our kids are changing. And when they change, all of a sudden, this daughter or son who used to like know the moment I fluttered my eyes when I woke up in the morning and they would run into my bedroom cannot be found in my house anymore. Like they're like by themselves. Like they don't want to be with me as much. The relationship somehow has changed in some sort of way. And I think some parents feel like, did I lose my mojo? Have I become a bad parent? Is that it? Did I take this thing as far as I can go? And now we're just sort of holding on for dear life after age 12 because maybe that's it. I hope I did enough, right? I think we could feel that way, and that can be a really defeating, overwhelming feeling as well. And so, I think when we're honest with these emotions, perhaps we can sort of face the fact that parenting is hard. And maybe there's some things that we hope for that are different. Two in particular, I think what we find as we've talked with parents, that they struggle with this idea that your child isn't who you thought they would be. Now, they never are, right? But I think sometimes, and I never realize it till they like prove me wrong. My kids prove me wrong, but I have in like my head this idea of who they're going to be. I don't know where that comes from. I think it's just me aspiring for my kids. But all of a sudden they make different choices, or they have different interests, or they have different skills. And all of a sudden I'm constantly having to recalibrate who I think my child is. And sometimes that can just be so scary because they're turning out maybe differently than what I thought they were going to be. And so I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that. And I think another struggle that parents bring up a lot of times is this idea that, your relationship with your child isn't what you thought it would be. Like I said before, you you had this connection, but all of a sudden that connection just doesn't feel like it's there anymore. And that's just, I think, really hard for us parents, right? Because we love our kids and we want to have that connection in any way that we can. And so I think sometimes parents buy into this narrative that as our kids grow up, we grow apart, that's just the way it is. And I think if that's the narrative, then I think there can be this anxiety. I think there can be this fear. I think there can be this giving up feeling because we don't know what to do, right? But I think what we've learned through some of our work is that growing up doesn't have to be growing apart. It actually can mean growing with. And what I want to do in our time is just briefly talk about some of our research and some of the major concepts in the book that Kara Powell and I wrote called Growing With, that unpacks some of these ideas and maybe helps you as parents sort of think about how you navigate your parenting from adolescence through emerging adulthood. So like I mentioned, Growing Young is a research piece that the Fuller Youth Institute did regarding churches. But one of the pieces that we didn't study in that research that we realized that we need to was the significance of the parent-child relationship in faith formation. It just wasn't part of that first study. And so we really tried to leverage our focus on that with Growing With. And so these are how these two books sort of talk together. And this is what we mean by growing with. It's a mutual journey of intentional growth for both parents and our children that trust God to transform us all. Now, notice what's interesting about this definition. If you look at most parenting books, especially ones with younger kids, it usually has some sort of title that has the spirit of how to get your child to do XYZ, right? Like, how to get them to be potty trained, how to get them to behave, or whatever it might be. And what's so interesting about those books is that the impetus, the thrust of the book is to get your children to behave, think, do something differently. Now, at very young children age, there's probably some appropriateness to that. But when we think about adolescence and emerging adulthood, we can't think about parenting in that way. It's not about getting them to do something while we sit passively back, sort of in the static state as though we're sort of passive observers. The only way that I think we can really help young people, our adolescent and emerging adult children, is to lean in with them. It's a mutual journey of intentional growth where we have to actually take some intentional steps to make changes for all of us, trusting that God actually can transform us all. I don't know about you, but I'm a trained pastor, I study this stuff, et cetera, et cetera. There is nothing that has transformed my life more than being a parent. It has exposed the ugliest parts of me. And it's also exposed some parts that are beautiful too, that I thank God for, right? The best and the worst come out of us through this thing called parenting, right? It's quite a ride. And so, I think there's something quite powerful about what God can do in these relationships and that God can do with us together. So with that in mind, let's take this a little bit further. So when we think about this idea of growing with, I want to take this idea of adolescence and emerging adulthood, and I want to break it down into three different categories rather than two. The first one is that of the learner. The learner is what we would call basically your basic teenage years, 13 to 18, okay? Learners need to learn. Their brains are changing and developing. They're in many ways experiencing things for the first time, and so they need to learn how to manage time, eat well, figure out their schedules, learn how to make friends, learn how to deal with conflict. These are things that they need to learn because they haven't done it for, this is the first time in many cases that they're really learning to do this for themselves. Learners and their brain development also allow them to think abstractly. So this is the first time in their lives that they really are beginning to conceptualize perfection, like what a perfect world might look like, or a perfect family might look like, or a perfect body might look like. And then they come to this devastating reality that nothing in their life is perfect. Now, as adults, we're like, well, what's so amazing about that? For a learner, for the first time to realize that there's perfection and they're not it, is a devastating, disorienting moment, right? And so learners are learning a lot. They're coming to grips with the reality of the world. And this is a lot of times where they start asking the why question, simply because they're trying to make sense of this dissonance that they're feeling. If your kids are asking why questions, this isn't because they're doubting the world. They're actually trying to make sense of it. It's a great place for them to be. Now, learners then eventually graduate to explorers. You'll see the overlap of the overlap of the circles here, meaning, the 13 to 18, 18 to 23 are general ranges. You always have early adapters and late bloomers. That's just part of development as well. But we're going to just kind of hold to this model, and you can adjust as you see fit. Explorers are those that are now 18 to 23. They've graduated high school. And this is the moment, really, the onset of emerging adulthood. This is when the rules sort of begin to change in life. Or I shouldn't say the rules change completely, but the multiple trajectories of young people change. Up to 18, most teenagers go to high school. Most teenagers live under the tutelage of a parent or guardian. Most of them are basically doing the same things as far as schedule goes, with, obviously, variance within that. But at 18, all of a sudden something happens. Like, as a person who is a legal adult, at least from a legal perspective, and they now have an opportunity to go to college, travel, join the military, take a gap year, work. I mean, the options begin to grow for them. And this is a time for explorers where they are now confronted with more opportunities than they've ever had before. And at the same time, they're still trying to figure out who they are. So there's a deep sense of anxiety as well. So there's hopefulness and excitement and anxiety and fear and self-doubting and a lot of self-guessing going on during this particular period in their lives. So explorers are exploring. They're beginning to sort of step out on their own, but still need a little help along the way, and I'll explain that in a second. And then focusers are really at 23 to 29. They're sort of focusing in on their lives. They're starting to get traction in the direction that they're going. We're going to spend most of our time looking at learners and explorers, but focusers, I think, are in this unique time in their lives where they've made choices. I mean, I just had a conversation with an emerging adult about this last week. So excited about some of the choices that they've made, but grieving the fact that they have to close the door on some of the other choices because they can't do it all. Some emerging adults are smart focusers are smarting from choices that they made earlier in their lives, and they're still playing catch up. But even the most talented ones, and these are a lot of the grad students that I work with, feel like they're behind in some aspect of their lives, their education, their relationships, their finances, the way that they should be, where they should be in life. This is sort of part of it. And focusers have this imaginary goal in their head that they need to have their act together by 30. Okay. There's no logical reason for that. That just seems to be sort of the significant moment. And so they think about that a lot. So there's a lot of anxiety as one moves toward 30, wondering if they're having their act together. Okay. Now, that's pretty cursory. We go into more detail in the book, but I just wanted to give you that. Now, if we think about this for a second, if there are learners, explorers, and focusers, the parenting question we have to ask is, what kind of parent does a learner, explorer, and focuser need? Okay. If young people are changing, if our kids are changing and growing up, that means that our parenting needs to also change as they grow up as well. So learners need a teacher. Okay. That's hardly like blowing your mind, right? But there is something about this idea of good teaching, right? How do we actually provide scaffolding or step-by-step instructions to help our learner kids, our teenager kids, begin to learn to do things for themselves in ways that will really help and serve them in the long way. So there's this intentionality that comes with that. We can't be impatient with them. This is part of working with them. And so we need the patience and the skill of a good teacher to be able to help learners begin to learn the skills that are necessary for them to start becoming contributing members of society. Now, explorers need a guide, okay? A guide, as you can see by the dots, the relationship is more side by side. For the teacher, I guess the parent is the circle with the hole in it. I'll let you make an interpretation about that. They're leading the way in this path of life, right? But in the explorer guide aspect, it's more mutual in the sense that they're walking together. And again, think about a hike for a second. A good guide knows when to let the people they're guiding take the lead and kind of go along certain terrain. But when the terrain gets technical, when more decisions are needed to be made, or just more skill is involved, the guide says, hey, wait a minute, let me just take us through this tricky section, and then you can pick it up again. So that's where guides know when to step in and when to lay back, and to kind of navigate where our kids are in this unique time in their lives where they're learning to take steps on their own, but still need a little bit of help along the way. And then focusers, again, need a resourcer. This is where the focuser is really taking the lead in their lives, and they see the resourcer as a resource, someone that they can lean on for maybe significant decisions in their lives that they're thinking about making, whether it's a big move or a relationship or some aspect of life that they've never done before. This is when a resourcer can kind of provide that wisdom along the way, but not really tell the focuser what to do, because the focuser is pretty focused on what they want to do. They're just looking for support, advice, input, perspective, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is the way that we can think about this model. Now, let me just test this model a little bit. Think of it in this way. Imagine for a second that you have a teenager, a learner, but the parent of this learner acts like a resourcer. Like perhaps they say something like, you know what, I had to learn things my own way, and that's just the way it is. And my kid, I know they're young, but they'll eventually learn. That's part of what it means to grow up. And so they don't really provide any sort of scaffolding or steps for the learner. I think at its most extreme form, that can look like a distant parent. Someone that really isn't close enough to give the teenagers or the learners the help that they need to develop the skills that help them with sort of everyday living that are so crucial in their learning time of life, okay? Another example would be this. If you've got an explorer child and the parent of that child still is acting like a teacher, they still see their kid as a learner or a teenager, right? What happens here is that a teacher parent can still be trying to take the lead and do the work. This is kind of, again, what helicopter parents are sort of about. And that creates problems because, explorers have different needs from their parents at this point. So I think a lot of times what happens when we sort of get our signals crossed, when we aren't pairing the type of parenting need that our learners, explorers, and focusers have, this is where the tension builds. This is where the disagreements happen. This is when we realize that perhaps we are trying to parent in a way that isn't matching where our kid is at. So again, the job of us parents is to take note of that. One more thing with this, maybe one of the toughest parts of parenting are the transition places between learners and explorers and focusers. Think about that for a second. The tools that you finally honed for your teenage kids are now obsolete around 18 because all of a sudden the rules have changed. They need something different from you, and you've got to learn and pick up tools that are new to you and let go of the ones that seemed so comfortable and so sure before. Okay, that's a really hard space. Same with explorer to focuser. For parents to begin to step back and let go, to let their kids take the lead, and to even be okay with maybe differing opinions of the way the world works or that type of thing. These are really tough places for parents because, again, they have to sort of set down perhaps the tools that worked for them before and pick up new ones for the relationship to work, okay? So maybe something to think about here is this, is that when you begin to your parenting strategies aren't working anymore with your child, don't default to saying, I'm a bad parent, or I don't know what I'm doing, the relationship is over. That's not what's happening here. Based on this, what I'm suggesting is all it means is that perhaps your child is growing into a new phase, and they need you to be a different type of parent to support them. So it's a signal for you to make adjustments. It's not because you failed, it's because it's time for adjustments because your child is growing up. Okay, that's a positive way to look at it. I kind of like that. Okay, so with that in mind, just a couple more things. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you might want to put this in the chat or maybe think about it. on your own or with maybe someone you're at with the Zoom video. But how might like this illustration be encouraging to you? I mean, how does this help? Might be encouraging. How might it be challenging to you? And how might it help you? Perhaps you can think about that on your own or chat a few things in if you'd like. Okay, let me keep going here. What do these three stages mean for growing with? Let me just offer some things for that. We have the learner, explore, focuser, but if you look at to the left, we really think there are three major things that I think sort of like life and parenting orbit around this idea of withing, adulting, and faithing. You'll see that they're all verbs. They're all the sense of depicting movement. I'm going to talk to you briefly about withing, and then I want to get to faithing because we're a faith community, and I think those things are important to you. And this is what Dane and Jake told me I need to talk about. So when we talk about this idea of withing, perhaps we can think about it in this way, that it's a family's growth and supporting each other as children grow more independent. Okay, so that relationship is changing. To stay with each other and connected with each other requires a constant negotiation because child is growing up, parent is still growing, and we have to somehow figure out this relationship. We can't default to old patterns anymore. And so that's where the withing comes along. I think what happens when our kids are younger is we kind of fall into this default of saying, hey, let me tell you what you need to do, right? We're more directive, we're more focused on sort of telling and giving our opinion, and then assuming that our kids will take that opinion because it's always brilliant. At least that's the way I think. Okay. What was interesting is this, is that there came a point in time with my kids where my wife, Jen, and I, we realized that our language had to change with them. And so we actually bought this piece of art that had these three words: tell me more. Okay, we put it in our living room, in our family room, sort of the main gathering place. And that was so important for us because my wife is a mental health therapist. I'm a pastor and a professor. We have more advice than we know what to do with. People pay us to give our advice. Our kids don't want it, right? So when they came to us with a question or a problem, or they wanted to talk about something, I think what Tell Me More allowed me to do was to stop and pause and listen for what my kids really wanted to talk about. So Tell Me More would be like, well, tell me more about that. How did you feel about that situation? Well, what do you think you should do? Where do you think this is headed? What does your friend think about that? Right? I just kept asking more questions because I wanted to understand more of the story. And 9 times out of 10, I realized that the initial question that my kid was asking wasn't the real question. The question was buried somewhere down in the story of what they really wanted to talk about or be affirmed about, or to test an idea with me. And that's what they really needed. And what I needed to do was hang in there with them, to not just give them a pat answer, but to really understand the story that they were immersing themselves in and thinking about. And so this Tell Me More really kind of changed the way Jen and I talked with our kids and really helped us think about that. I told this to another church, and they went out and they actually put Tell Me More on the side of their building that faced the major intersection in their downtown city, because I think they wanted to say, hey, look, we're a church that has this amazing answer called the gospel, the Jesus story, but we want you to know something, that we care about your story too. And we want to hear that, and we want to understand that. So you can come, and when you come to this church, we want you to tell us more about who you are. And I just thought that was really, really beautiful. So one other thing I'll say about the withing is this, is that I think sometimes as parents, we think that what our kids really need more than anything else is for them to know more things, especially when it comes to spirituality. What's interesting is this, is that one of the largest longitudinal studies done in the United States found this out, that it wasn't the content that really got passed on from generation to generation, good teaching. What passed on faith from generation to generation was the relational warmth that young people experienced. When the family they perceived as being warm and connected and close, they were more apt to adopt their family's values and carry them forward. When the family's relationships was distant and cold, they were less apt to do that. So I think it's an important thing for us to think about, that when we think about what we're teaching our kids, that's fine. The content is important, but the relational context can make all the difference in the ways that we allow and help our kids begin to understand the values of our family and perhaps even the faith that's important to us. And so really thinking about that relationship with your child is really, really crucial, because I think it makes a difference in the ways that they even think about their spirituality. Maybe this is a place that we can pause really quickly, and you can just think on your own about this or later. Think about the last time you felt like you had a great connection with your child. Think about when that was. I don't care if it was yesterday or it was a year ago, it doesn't matter. And then I just want you to celebrate that, because you had a connection with your kid, and that's awesome. And then maybe just think about how you can do it again. What was it about that connection that worked? Was it the time of day? Was it the subject matter? Were you out on a walk? What were you doing? Like with my daughters, like my oldest daughter, like a coffee shop with us both reading books together, and then we kind of look up once in a while and have a conversation. That's what works for us. My middle daughter, we've got to go out on a run together. We've got to be moving. My youngest daughter, breakfast and a deep conversation right away. Like I had to learn ways of withing with them that really worked. And so I think we can ask those questions that could be really helpful. Secondly, when have you felt distance between you and your child? And I think what you can ask yourself is, well, what was it about that just didn't work? And then what strategies might you try to approach it in a different sort of way, right? So much of withing is really about improvisation. Rather than coming at the subject that maybe brings tension between you in the same way, what are creative different ways that you can come at that? And that hopefully can maybe turn the corner in some of the areas you all feel stuck, or it's just not a subject that goes really well, okay? So the last thing I want to talk about really quickly is this idea of faithing. Faithing is an interesting word. The way we define it is this: it's owning and embodying our journeys with God as we encounter new experiences and new information. So what's happening with faithing is it's this movement that's sort of going on. And one of the ways I think about it is like this. I think oftentimes when we think about faith, we think about it as sort of a noun, right? I have faith. I accept faith. I'm afraid of losing faith. I'm afraid of my kids losing their faith. Do you notice how we use the term? It's like this thing that we possess. Now, part of that is completely fine. I'm not going to get in a big debate about that. But there's also something limiting to that, because faith is more than just something we possess. It's actually something we do. There's faithing. I mean, if you look at the scriptures, God calls us to believe in, trust in, lean into, depend on, right? These are words that are used that are they're perpetual. It's not a one-time act. It's this perpetual daily dependence upon God that we are navigating along the way, right? So life and faith are moving, and within faithing, then faithing is adjusting and changing and adapting to the new experiences and new information that come their way. It has to. I mean, that's just the way life works, right? And in every aspect of our lives, including our faith journeys as well. Some other things to know about faithing is that it's going to change over time between a teenager, a younger emerging adult, and an older emerging adult. It has to, because their lives are getting more complicated along the way. I'll explain more in a second. The other thing that's interesting is that sometimes when we think about faithing or faith, we think about it only as an intellectual endeavor. Have you ever done this? I have, I'll admit it. My kid will say, I'm really struggling with this subject or that subject. And my instinct is to say, hey, you know what? I've got a great book for you to read, or I've got a podcast for you to listen to, right? Do you notice what I'm doing there? I'm instantly thinking that the reason that my kid is struggling in their faithing journey is because they're not thinking right. And if they just had a little bit more information, that would solve the problem. That may be the case, but it's not always the case. Actually, we find that there are other components associated with it. Sometimes the reason that faith and doubt are always at play is because there's a relational element to it. How I feel connected with a community or whether I don't. And then there's emotional elements associated with that as well. Joy, shame, fear, all those things have an effect on the way I conceptualize my belief in God and my following of Jesus. Some of the research that I did with college students, I asked them about the way that they navigated and worked through spiritual struggle while they attended a university. And what was interesting is that a common theme that they would often say is something like this. They'd say, Steve, I know that what I'm learning at my university sometimes contradicts what I learned at my church or from my family, intellectual. They said, but I'm afraid, notice the emotional, that if I share my new thinking with my family or community, that my pastor will be disappointed, that my mom will be upset, that my dad will be angry, and that my church may put me on the prayer list. And we all know nobody wants to be on the prayer list, right? So, what's interesting is this. Do you notice what's happening there? That for a young person, an intellectual doubt can lead to relational fallout. They actually begin to see, if I actually raise the questions and doubts that I have, that it could actually affect the relationships of people that are important to me. You see what can happen there? So this faithing dynamic is more than just intellectual. It actually runs much deeper than that. And so I think we just have to remember that as our kids are going through this faithing trajectory, that they are incredibly vulnerable. They're sort of putting it out there. And for them to say, I'm doubting or I'm questioning or I have these concerns, recognize in that moment, that's not a moment of unbelief. It's actually a moment of faithing. And it's also a moment of vulnerability where we can do one of two things. We can shut it down, or we can step into that space and try to hold it with them. Now, what makes that hard is that some research would suggest that this idea of working through faith and struggle is contagious, okay? So if my kid raises questions about God, about faith, about doubts that they might have, sometimes it evokes in me my own questions and doubts and things that perhaps I have pushed down or forgotten about, but sometimes they become resurfaced again, and it makes us anxious. So sometimes I want to solve my kids' problems, not just to help them, but because then I don't have to deal with it. You see what happens there? So, so our kids' faithing journeys have a direct impact, oftentimes, upon our own faithing journeys. And now it's sort of a withing endeavor all over again, right? As we think about this idea of faithing. So, what does this mean for us faithing together? I think a couple of things. I think just we have to remember that silence is not a good idea. Like faithing requires sort of more than that. And I think a great place to begin is to begin to ask each other questions about our faith journeys. That's a great way to start, that hopefully can lead to more and deeper conversations that eventually leads to fluency. Some researchers would say that faith language is like a real language. Like the more we integrate it into our everyday lives, the more fluent we become. And then it doesn't become this sort of awkward, sacred thing that only gets used in proper moments. And so it never feels right in real life. So it gets relegated to a part of the week or a particular service or event, but it isn't part of the rest of our lives. If we can integrate it in part of our everyday lives, the fluency that comes with that faithing can be really, really helpful to young people that want to know whether or not their faith can actually keep up with their everyday lives. So as we think about this really quick, let me just try to offer some practical steps here and then we'll wrap it up. When it comes to learner faithing, I think one of the things we can remember is this, is that we know from some of our own research of sticky faith that 70% of teenagers experience doubt. Now, what's interesting is only half of them ever say they told anybody, which is interesting when you go back to my other chart about the emotional, relational, and intellectual element associated with this. Learners most see Jesus through a person. Now, we might say that's like not right. They should not look at me, but look at Jesus. But for a teenager, an adolescent, the only way they can make sense of something abstract as spirituality, Jesus even, is to see Jesus-like qualities in people that they trust. And so this is why a lot of times young people are devastated when a youth leader leaves their community, because for them, that was the closest thing to Jesus that they had, in their minds, right? So this can be a really, really challenging time for them. And for them, faithing almost has this connection with belonging. Like the faithing makes sense because we all believe it together. Again, there's limitations to that, but for a teenager, that's really important. Community is really important. Connecting with others that share similar beliefs is really important. And so learner faithing must connect with the relationships that are most important to them. So what's more important than perhaps even going to youth group, Jake, don't hate me for that. I know they should go to your youth group, but is the relationships that they're connected with. Who are the people that are faithfully following Jesus that are connecting with your kids, and how do you allow that to continue to grow? I think those things can be really helpful. And I think another way to really help our kids is to remember that sharing our own faith story actually helps your learner understand their faith story. You saying to them, "Hey, you know what? Jesus is really important in our family, but have I ever told you why, like how I like started following Jesus, um, that could be like a 2-minute conversation, or it could be over a whole dinner, however your family works. But I think as you begin to share your own story, it gives more context and meaning to their story as they're beginning to write it as well. And it gives them a little bit of insight into your life. So, maybe that's just a simple way to think about faithing is, how can I tell my own faithing story? Where I came from, what happened, where I am now, why it's important to all of us. Those are important questions for learners. And remember that the learner's best picture of the church comes through the adults who invest in them. It really does. They want people in their lives that love them with no strings attached. And this is something that I think is so beautiful about the church and what youth ministry can do, and those type of things that can be really, really, really helpful. Secondly, when it comes to explorer faithing, let me just say this. In some of my own research that I did, when I asked college students, tell me what do you think contributed to the spiritual struggle that you went through in college. And this is a longer survey, but that's basically the way what I was asking them for. And what they said was this, is that the on-campus contributors to struggle really centered on two things. Educational and classroom experiences. So they would hear something from the professor that was different than what they heard, and it created a sense of dissonance. But then also finding friends and connecting relationally. These two experiences oftentimes had this deeper effect of them beginning to question maybe some of their foundational beliefs about God. Like, is what was taught to me true? I thought God was faithful and I don't have friends and I'm lonely. What does that mean? And so I found that really interesting. Off campus, usually there was struggle or doubt that often was evoked through family death or illness. Something traumatic happened, and obviously that caused a questioning of God's faithfulness, of God's love, and them sort of wrestling with that. Okay, that's not completely surprising. I asked them though, well, how did you work through the struggle that you were experiencing? The two predominant answers were this, is that, and I divide them by on campus and off campus. They said that one of the key things that they do to try to work through a spiritual struggle is to go talk with their friends. Okay. Now, I think that's fine. I think it's great. But I think we also know that there's something about the blind leading the blind when there's just peers in a relationship. There's only so much life experience that they have to really help themselves through that. So while helpful and supportive, it could be limiting. And then the other way that they tried to work through struggle was basically on their own, through the internet, reading, trying to figure it out themselves. And it struck me that seems like a pretty lonely existence. That when an explorer is going through the significant time of faithing and doubting as they navigate their faith, that their options for working through it was perhaps a peer and oftentimes on their own. And what struck me was, as a researcher, I was listening to these stories, and many of them would say to me, you're the first person that I've ever shared the story with about the struggle that I had or whatever. And as a researcher, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. As a pastor and as a dad, it broke my heart, because I was just thinking to myself, well, where are the people in their lives that they can actually navigate these things with and help them with? And so I think we just have to be open to this idea that as our explorers are going through faithing and doubting, which in many ways go hand in hand, they need the support of people that love them and care for them and can give them perspective of how to navigate and work through that. This information struck me so much that I started to do this with my daughters. We would go out for coffee, and we just had an agreement that somewhere in the conversation before our coffees were done, we would talk about something a little more significant. It wasn't threatening. It was just our way to, just know that we were going to talk about something like that. And here's a question that I would ask them regularly. What's something you believe that you don't think I believe? Okay. Sometimes I would reverse it and say, what's something you don't believe that you still think I believe? Okay. And then I would hold my breath, because I'd be like, what are they going to say? Now, majority of time, or a lot of time, they that it wasn't that dramatic. But there were other times where we had some really significant conversations about questions that they had and why our family believed this, or we held to this when they're learning this, or they have a friend that believes this, or whatever it might be. Um, and the point of the question wasn't to debate. The point of the question was to communicate to my daughters that no matter what you say, whether we agree or disagree, I'm here. I'm not leaving. We're in this together. You are not alone. You can talk to me about these things. I think explorers need to know that we're willing to hang in there with them, even when our beliefs might diverge or they have certain doubting questions that they're working through. And so faithing in many ways is this process of believing and doubting, okay? Doubting is not the enemy of faith. It's actually a friend of faithing, because it's through the doubting that we raise questions that allow us to then work through those questions and have a bigger, better, more profound sense of who God is and who we are in relation to God and the world. Okay, so that's the way that we, I think, need to think about that. So when it comes to explorer faithing, maybe just keep this in mind. You know, explorers must make sense. Like faith has to make sense to them, and it has to keep up with their increasingly complex worlds. As their worlds get more complex, faith needs to do that as well. And you know what? I believe it can. And we just have to help them understand that. And so I think that's one way we can really help them. Also, remember that a couple of things, that explorers' doubt doesn't have to erode their faith. It actually can enhance it. Like I said before, it helps us raise the questions and gives opportunity to work through them. And then at the same time, remember that explorers' disconnections from church doesn't mean they don't care about church. There's a lot of press out there saying young people are leaving the church, they graduate, and it's all over. From after high school, it's all over, et cetera, et cetera. There are some narratives that are true with that, but there are also narratives of young people finding God in amazing ways. And what's interesting about church attendance is that I think sometimes we overinterpret what attendance means. Sometimes it's because they really don't like the church. Other times, they're just trying to figure out their lives and they haven't found a rhythm to show up at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning. A lot of times I tell older people like myself, like, hey, would you go to a service at 9 p.m. on Sunday night? They're like, absolutely not. I'm like, that's how young people feel about 9 a.m., right? So I think we just have to be careful to recognize the fact that if our kids are not like quickly like jumping on a rhythm of going to church, it doesn't mean that they've gotten rid of God or they don't care about the church. It could be that they're actually having to learn to find a church, get connected again, find a rhythm in life that works for them and helps them move forward. So I think we can be patient with that and not be too quick to jump to a conclusion that they're checking the faith because they're not going to church. Now, a couple more things I'm going to wrap up here. When it comes to parents faithing, remember, this is growing with. So we have our own job to be faithing ourselves. And here's just some things I'd encourage you to think about. Where do you feel like you're growing in your own faithing? You know, a lot of times we ask our kids where they're growing, but where do you feel like your growth edge is? Again, that's not a shaming question. It's just a question I think it's important for us to understand as we think about what it means to grow with our kids. Also, what doubts do you have? We all have them. I'm not the only one, I hope. I don't think I am. But we have our own questions and doubts that we're working through. And I think that just normalizes the fact that it's not just our kids that are working through doubts, but we are as well. And then maybe just, again, a real practical thing is, when might you tell your own faithing story to your kid if you haven't done that before? Even if you have done it before, is there more that you can share about that? I think that's just a great way to begin moving faithing from and faith language from being something that's sort of separate and not connected with real life to something that can be. And then I think when it comes to growing with, just 3 things for parents to think about. First of all, I just want to encourage you, and you're already doing it because you're all on this Zoom session, find a friend or group to grow together. Remember what I said at the beginning, that we have this instinct as our kids get older to just isolate ourselves more and more. Let's fight against isolation and find some peers that have kids maybe similar ages that we can navigate this time together. It really helps. It normalizes some of the challenges, and I think can give you the support that you need. Also, I just want you to accept your own parenting journey. There's so much comparison out there of who we're supposed to be like, or what somebody else is doing, or what their kids are like. But I would imagine on this call, we have all types of parents. We've got single parents, we've got foster parents, we've got step parents, we've got married parents, we've got grandparents that are all playing a significant parenting role in a child's life. And that's your journey. It's your unique journey. You don't need to compare with anybody else. You just need to own what you're called to and who God has given you in your child, and to love them as ferociously as you possibly can. So don't look to the left or the right when it comes to comparing. I mean, just own your own, and keep moving forward. I just want to encourage you to do that. And then finally, I tell this to parents more and more. I think it's probably my own discovery. But I think we've learned as parents to be interested in our kids. I mean, like, not like show you my kids on my cell phone, look at all these pictures, blah, blah, blah. But I think as our kids get older, I think they need to know that we're interested in them. And I think they need to know that we're interesting, that we continue to invest in ourselves, that that though we're getting older, we're still enamored with the world, in the sense of we're curious, we're growing, we're learning, et cetera, et cetera. So like a lot of times I'll ask my daughters like, well, what they're reading. And as I ask that question to them, I know I have to be prepared for them to ask that question back to me. Like, what am I reading? What am I thinking about lately, right? This allows us to have a really generative conversation with our kids and model to them that, the learning doesn't stop, that we are curious people as well. And I think that can be really, really inspiring to them. Really quickly, the Fuller Youth Institute, which I also work with at Fuller Seminary, has a regular blog. And this week I wrote a reflection on Lent and Lent's invitation to parents. It's really written with me speaking to parents of adolescents and emerging adults. You may find this interesting, and you can find it on the Fuller Youth Institute site. So I just want to let you know about that, and I'm sure these guys will pass on the link to you if you want it. The last thing I want to say is that some of the research would suggest that especially when it comes to emerging adulthood, that parents' relationships with their growing child generally gets better. Okay. So if you've had a great relationship, say with your teenager, or you're in one that's really great, the chances are that you can actually, it can still get better, right? And that's encouraging. But here's the other thing I love parents to know, that if you're in the middle of, or you've experienced a sort of a rough relational period with your kids in their teenage years, the relationship's not over. There's something about them getting older and you getting older where there's a chance to almost hit a reset button and repair some of the relationship, and the relationships actually get closer and better. So don't give up. If you think you've blown it, you haven't blown it forever. That your past doesn't need to define your future, and there is hope for you and hope for your relationship with your kids. And I don't know about you, but sometimes as a parent, I just need to know that, because there are times I've said things or done things that I wish I could just take back, and I can't now, right? And those are really hard moments. But by the grace of God, and for what we know from the research, I think we can have hope that that there's still hope ahead, and I think that can be really encouraging. Last but not least, this is the book that I've been referring to. And also, if you go to growingwithbook.com, there's a bunch of free resources there, including a podcast that Kara Powell and I did with different parents that talk about different issues. You might find that really, really helpful. We're just here to resource you and help you in any way that you can, because we believe in you and we're cheering for you. And I'm really grateful for this chance to interact with you. So I'm going to turn off the share button now. I'm going to pass it back to Dane and Jake. And again, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Argue. That was, yeah, my mind is still in the process of coming back together after being blown. We'll take just a few minutes for some questions. Dana and I will kind of go back and forth and pick questions. One question that I see that I'm just going to go for, because I've talked to so many parents about it. One parent asked that it seems that these draw them out kind of questions presume a kind of conversational openness with your child. They're willing just to stay and talk to you even.
Yeah.
And so what do you do when the child just seems to shut down almost all attempts to connect?
Yeah, been there. I think that if that happens, I think number one, it's normal. I think number two, I would just again say, don't take the fail of your attempt as a definition of your relationship. The way you came at it that time just didn't work, right? So try to explore different ways to engage your child when they might be more open to having those conversations. Unfortunately, I found that usually when they're most apt to want to talk is when I'm dead tired. If you ever noticed that. But I would just say, keep trying and don't give up. A lot of times, I think kids want to know that we're not going to give up, that we're going to keep trying. And if you think you feel awkward, I think you need to understand that your kid feels awkward as well. This isn't about them being like, you better show me that you can actually show up in my life and I'm going to see if you can do it. I think they're like, I don't know how to talk to you as an older kid now. And I'm learning that as well. And so I think what they need you to do is go first and for you to keep trying. And if it doesn't work, then just kind of don't take it personally. I think it's much more complicated than that. But I think over time, I think eventually it can get a bit more natural and it won't feel so awkward. These conversations are always awkward at first, but I think that they can get better. So I guess I would say that just don't give up. It's part of this ongoing relational process where you're learning to continually engage each other in new ways. It's a great question.
Wonderful. Again, that was awesome, Steve. And I wanted to let everyone know too. We'll take a couple more questions because I know we're over 9. But this was like just a bite-sized appetizer of so much wonderful richness in this Growing With book. That's why we kept it in our lobby before the pandemic. We also, to make this really practical, we would encourage you to take a step to read that book in a group. And so if you want to, I just put our emails in the chat, my email and Jake's email. Just let us know you're interested in that, and we'll coordinate everyone in a group. We'll work with one of you on facilitating that. And just maybe that's a great healthy step just into, we need support, especially right now with everything going on. So
absolutely,
I encourage you to slow down with this content. And we have this recorded, so you can watch it again as well.
Over and over again.
Yeah.
Wow, that just sounds like.
It was great. Well, I had a mind-blowing week, or mind-blowing moment every week in our 10, 11 weeks together in seminary, and you packed a lot of those paradigm shifting things in there. So thank you. That was really intentional and well done.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that.
So this question was our first one that came in. I thought it was great. Talking about learners. Many learners want to be adults, they said, and perceive teaching as controlling. So how do we teach in a way that's not perceived as controlling?
Yeah, that's great. And I unpack this a little bit more in the book, and I think that's a great instinct in your question. So I think a lot of teaching we think of is just like telling kids what to do, but really good teaching is learner-centered teaching. What we're doing is we're connecting the experiences that we have with new information that we encounter, and we're helping them make that connection along the way. That's actually the way learning works. And not only does that way learning works, but it also is a better motivator as well, because now all of a sudden we're inspiring them to want to be curious rather than just telling them what to do, which is sort of met with more threats and things like that. So I think sometimes the way you can teach is just asking wondering questions, right? Like, I wonder what you think about that, or I wonder how we could solve this problem. What are some options that you have, and sort of draw them out to think that way, rather than you've got these 3 things to choose from, choose one. So I think there's a finesse and an art to teaching, and we all know our kids well enough to probably know which way to approach with that. That can help them develop steps to become more competent in sort of the everyday things that they're working on. And you're going to get the pushback from a kid because I don't think they want to look incompetent. Who does, right?
Yeah.
So they're going to be like, oh, I don't need to know that. They might, but you can just kind of say, well, great, okay, well, if you try, but if you got any questions, there's no shame. Come on, let's talk about how that worked, and we can do that, right? Like, depending on the kid, I think you can navigate that and sort of test those waters. But I think it's that scaffolding piece that's really important to help them sort of gain some confidence and kind of be there when things don't go well either. But I think it's a great question.
Awesome. Maybe one or two more.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that.
That's all right.
This was asked earlier, then I think it was kind of reworded in a different way. How does modeling one's own faith to a young person change across the 3 segments you shared? And what does fluency and faithing look like across those 3 segments?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And again, I maybe every answer starts with this. Depends on your kid. I do think I talk with my kids who are now in their 20s much different than I talked with them when they were teenagers on everything. But when it comes to faithing, I think there's just more nuance, right? I think we talk a lot more about the blur that comes with what it means of choosing the right way to follow God. In my Christian faith, as they encounter different situations, we talk and sort of turn ideas to think about spirituality, ethics, morality, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the older a young person gets in our relationship with them, I think the depth and nuance that comes with faithing is really, really important. Like with a 14-year-old, I think if you want to talk about faithing in youth group, let's say, like they say, I don't want to go to Jake's youth group tonight. I just don't feel like it. Well, I think that's a moment at a very base level to have a conversation about, well, why don't you want to go? Like, what makes it hard for you? What would happen if you did go? From our perspective, being part of a community is really important. So, and you sort of negotiate that. If they're 24 and they're like, I don't want to go to church, I'm not going to be like, you need to go to church. I think I'm going to say, well, how do you find Christian community if you're not going to go to church? What do you think community means when it comes to your faith? Is it just an individual thing, or is there a collective element that's really important along the way? How are you mentored? You know what I mean? I just think that the layers and complexity change over time, and it requires something of us as parents as well, and that is to continue to grow in our own faithing as well. And so that fluency comes, I think, with hopefully over time, where these faith conversations are not compartmentalized anymore. They literally are sort of intertwined in the ways that we talk about life, faith, relationships, and everything else, right? Another example, a teenager, I'm not going to debate when one should start dating. We all have different opinions on that. But I think it would be pretty clear to say, it'd really be stupid for you to date a non-Christian kid. Like that's just not a good idea. Like we're, for whatever reason. Okay, I'm being a bit emphatic. We don't have to debate about that, right? I think if they were older, I think I would have to talk to them much more nuanced about what is a relationship? What does it mean to follow Christ? Can you envision your life together? What are the challenges or the opportunities that could be there as you have maybe different perspectives on worldview? And how might that help or hurt you, right? And I think we talk with our kids differently about that. But hopefully with the fluency is that none of those topics are taboo or off, or out of bounds. Like we can actually bring faith into our everyday conversations because we've practiced it along the way. And that's where the fluency comes in. I think the more that we practice it, the easier it gets. And we will fail. We will say stupid things. Something won't come out right. And we just have to allow that to happen. And one of the things I would tell my kids a lot is this, like, look, you're going through life for the first time and I'm going to cut you some slack. But let me tell you something. I'm going through being a parent for the first time. So if you can just cut me a little slack, I know I'm going to make mistakes. Just tell me. But I won't expect you to be perfect if you don't expect me to be perfect. And let's just sort of figure it out together. Again, I'm not going to necessarily say that to like a 13-year-old, but I think as they get older, I think that helps us name each other's humanness in this process. And expect that we're going to make some mistakes rather than like setting up this unrealistic expectation that my child will be perfect or that my parent will be perfect. And I don't know about you, but that just, for me, just kind of takes the temperature down a little bit, and we're not always walking on eggshells.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Argue. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who came here again tonight. Dr. Argue, I feel like you've done a great job of just defining reality right now. We have a lot of thank yous coming in the chat as well. So people just, I think, really appreciated this. And, you know, this is challenging. I think the word you used so many times as you described each of these stages, and then as parents, was anxiety, and what an anxious time it is to be in this phase or in this phase, in this phase. And if this just helps us a little bit as parents, just in seeing that and owning that, and we're not alone in that, hopefully that can help us become a little bit of more of a non-anxious presence for our kids, and to be able to step out and rely on each other. We're here for you too. We're not in competition with you. We're not marketing to you. We're wanting to come alongside you and parent with you too, as we are on this amazing sacred call from God to be parents together. So it's an awesome thing at the end of the day. So man, appreciate you. And it's getting close to 9:30, so we're gonna let you go. Value your time so much. And
yes.
God
Great. Thanks. Hey, can I pray for everybody before we go? Would that be all right?
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
God, thanks for my fellow parents who love their kids more than anybody else in the world. Thank you for calling them to be parents, to play parenting roles. Would you give them courage this week where they need the courage? Would you give them encouragement where they just need just a little glimmer of hope this week to keep going? Would you give them support when they feel overwhelmed with things that flood our kids and families' lives, and especially in this time of pandemic where everything just seems to be even more dramatic than ever before? And may you remind these dear parents that their past doesn't have to define their future, that they were called to love and lead their kid, and they can rely on that confidence, and that they would find great joy in the role that you've given them. And may they know God's grace and peace. Amen. Thanks, everybody.
We're
great to see all of you.
Come up in person in a couple years so we can just glean for a few hours over coffee. All right.
I would love that. We'll do that for sure. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, you guys. We'll see you soon. Okay, bye.
Thanks, everybody.